Today's podcast is brought to you in part by Manning Publications. If you use the discount code YTFisher at checkout, you'll get 40% off my Docker in Motion course. It is 5.5 hours long and it teaches the fundamentals of Docker. Go to howtocodewell.net/Docker in Motion to get my course or other video courses and books from Manning Publications. Link in the description below. Hello coders and welcome to another How to Code Well podcast. Today we're going to be talking about teaching and I have the absolute pleasure of being joined by a local streamer. Hello Ted, how's it going? Have you had a good week?
Yeah, I've had a great week. One of my better weeks. So thanks. Yeah.
Better weeks. What's a better week?
So I love presenting and teaching, and so I also like doing it to a more community-like events. And so this past weekend in Silicon Valley was the big Silicon Valley Code Camp on Saturday and Sunday, and so I got a chance to give 2 talks and talk to a bunch of people and find out what they're up to, what they're thinking, and sort of also meet up with folks I haven't seen since the last Code Camp.
Yeah, I guess as a teacher, that's really that's really important to do these things and find out what your audience like wants and needs and all of that.
Yeah, and what's fun about that is it's a very low anxiety event for me because it's not like a big conference. It's a very community oriented thing, and I feel like I can experiment a little bit and try things out that I might not do it at sort of a larger conference. So it's kind of freeing in that way.
So you teach offline and on Twitch, and we'll talk about that in more detail. I'll pick that apart in just a second. But before we delve into that, let's talk about your background.
Sure.
So how did you get into coding and in particular Java?
So I got into coding because I was privileged enough when I was 10 years old that there was a local private high school that had a PDP-11 with a teletype printing on that yellow roll paper and had paper tape feed to store your programs. And, I don't know if I'd call it coding. I mean, yes, we wrote in BASIC and we wrote silly little things. But that was definitely something, that sort of sparked my interest. And then after that, got a TRS-80 from Radio Shack, the Model 1 with 4K running a Z80 processor.
Wow.
And, typing in games and all sorts of things from the magazines.
You're showing your age here. You're showing your age.
Absolutely. And also got an Apple II Plus with the language card. So this was not a common thing. This added more memory so it could run UCSD Pascal.
Right.
Which was amazing to work with, but very different than anything I had done before because I was doing basic programming. And my father was doing stock market investing, and there's this whole thing about technical analysis, drawing charts and drawing lines and drawing curves and running through formulas. And I basically took a program that he had someone write in Pascal, and I converted it to run on an Apple II Plus in AppleSoft Basic to basically draw stock charts.
Okay.
And at the time, there was maybe one other application that did this. And so I was 13 at the time at this point. And it was picked up and purchased by a company called Dow Jones when they published software. So the Dow Jones chart program was something that I wrote.
Wow.
And so I was a professional, right? Professional means you get paid. So at that point I was a professional.
Wow.
And that pretty much, socked that away for college.
Gosh.
So that's how I got started coding.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah.
Wow. So, gosh. So, I mean, what? I'm just trying to take that in. So you wrote the charting software for Dow. Oh wow, gosh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I wrote it, and my dad was I don't know how Dow Jones found out about us, but we were publishing it on our own. And then they decided they wanted to take it on. And it's really interesting because I look, there's some things that stand out for me when I was writing it, that were, I don't know if innovative is the right word, but, so one of the things it did was download stock market data. It had to get the data from somewhere in order to draw the chart. It had to download it from somewhere. And so, when I wrote the downloader part, one of the things I did was sort of indicate progress on the screen by saying, we've downloaded this much and this percent. And I remember Dow Jones commenting like, wow, that's really cool that like you can tell us like how far you, and to me, it seemed so obvious, like providing feedback. Yeah. And that's something that's been sort of consistent throughout my career is this, really caring about the user, really having empathy for the person who's sitting there waiting for the data to download, especially, this was in the days of 300 baud modems. So it was not quick.
No.
To even download just one stock's worth of data. And so those kinds of things where really thinking about who's using this and what are they feeling, what do they care about, and providing that feedback. And I was just like, well, what else would you do?
What inspired you to do such a thing like that? What was the thing that, maybe it was a weekend and you go, oh, what I'm going to do today? I'm going to do this. How did that happen?
You mean in terms of writing the whole program?
Yeah. What was the thing that sparked that off?
It was really my dad. So he had hired someone to write the charting analysis program because he wanted it for his own work and he was publishing a small newsletter. But then, and I forget the reason. I think they wanted to modify it, and I think that they wanted to sell it, and having the requirement of someone who wanted to buy it to have the language card, this was not a cheap thing. Over and above already an Apple II Plus, now buying this additional several $100s, which probably in today's dollars would be close to $1,000, was not a good requirement. So I basically ported it and then continued to add on to it and wrote the downloaders. And I just loved it. It was very stressful because, I did not know how to manage my time, and, I'm 12, 13 years old. Yeah. So, but, it was definitely, there were some low points and like figuring stuff out, how to do things.
Did you write?
Because there was no internet.
No, sure.
No internet. It was all like figuring stuff out.
Yeah. Gosh. So, okay. So, did you go with the idea of I'm going to build this for Dow Jones, or did Dow Jones come and pick it up after you wrote it?
The latter. We basically wrote it, and then they said this is something we'd like to sell. So
am I right in thinking then the motivation to write it was just out of curiosity?
It was, I wanted to help my dad.
Right. Yeah.
And it was something really interesting to work on. And, yeah, because if it wasn't fun, I mean, again, sure. I was 13 or 14. If it wasn't fun, I wouldn't be doing it.
No.
It's not like a job where I got my bread. It's like, it's got to be fun and challenging just enough, that, you sort of get into that flow of like, so it was definitely fun. And it's really kind of interesting because for a while, and so this leads into sort of how I got into Java or how I learned Java, the first thing I ever wrote whenever I switched languages. So my sort of first language, sort of after doing a lot of basic and quick basic, was Visual Basic. So I'd been doing a lot of stuff with quick basic and working close with Microsoft on some things, and basically got into the beta for the Visual Basic 1.0 product. So this was really, really early days. This was, late 80s, early 90s. And so the first program I wrote for Visual Basic was a stock charting program. Excellent. And Microsoft loved this. so Microsoft, when they announced the product, they did a roadshow, going around and demonstrating it. And they used my program. And the reason why they loved it is they loved comparing the stock charts of IBM and Microsoft. Because at the time, IBM was the big Goliath, and Microsoft was, not as nearly as big. And so they loved showing the two, because I had a comparison thing that could show, how the stocks compared, and IBM's would go, ooh, and Microsoft's would, ooh. So they loved showing that. So that's what it became, anytime I learned something new, I'd write a stock charting program in it.
Yeah.
And then so, in sort of once I really got into Visual Basic in the mid 90s, I wanted to do things that Visual Basic wouldn't let me do. That at that point you had to write things in C++, in what were called custom controls. And so I took C++ courses, and you know what, the pointer stuff, just my brain just like star, and then some my brain just did not accept it. It just completely rejected that whole concept.
I know.
I'm like, I felt so dumb. I felt so stupid. And I'm like, I just forget it. I'm not going to do it. And then Java came along, and I looked at it, and it's like, it had all the things that I wanted from sort of a more advanced language, and OO and things like that. And I didn't have to deal with pointers.
Right.
And I didn't have to deal with memory allocation. Yeah. I'm like, oh, this is perfect for me. And so the first thing I did was write after a couple of toy things, write a stock charting, application in it. And this was really before the 1.0 release of Java. And so I had access to the beta, and for a little bit I had access to a Sun Microsystems workstation, because that was the only thing it would run on before they ported it to Windows. And then I've been playing with it and writing programs in it, and sold a few. It's kind of like one of those really early web things where you have a banner moving across the top of the screen with some advertisement or something like that. And I wrote a Java applet when applets were still a thing, and sold that.
Yeah.
And so then that was around the time that a friend of mine said, hey, I'm teaching C++, but there's this company that wants to, I think it was actually, who was it? I know Lotus, when it was still a separate company, was an early client. And they were just, can you teach us Java? And he didn't know Java, but he figured, it's similar enough to C++ and I knew Java and did not want to be teaching C++. And I had no idea if I could teach this stuff, but he had been teaching. And so I figured, okay, let's work together on this. And we delivered a course, and I have no idea if it was any good. I actually still have some of the early training materials, and I look back on it as like, oh my God, this is so much of an information dump with sort of in this traditional way of teaching a language, which is, let's start with all the syntax. Let's start with all of these little details that I now know are like completely useless and completely the wrong way to teach.
Right. That's interesting. Okay. Before we delve into that, let's because I want to go into that. I want to pick that apart. That's a nugget of awesomeness. But how long have you been a Java developer for?
Since then. So basically, I've been pretty much a Java developer for as long as you could be a Java developer and not having worked at Sun.
That's the best response.
Fact, our training course, we were teaching it before Sun had their act together.
No way.
Yeah.
Gosh. And what other technologies do you work with Java?
You mean other languages, or the frameworks I use are things like Spring, because so a while back I was using I don't know if you'd call it I guess it's a framework. It's interesting, like what's a framework for? It was a framework. So it was a framework called Drop Wizard, which was sort of gluing together a bunch of common things in the Java ecosystem. But then once Spring got to the point where I didn't have to write anything in XML. So older Spring, you had to like write some configuration stuff in XML, and I just hated that. And so once sort of Spring got to fully being able to do stuff in Java as opposed to doing stuff in XML. And now, especially with Spring Boot, that just made sort of this idea that I think Rails did a good job on of just like, convention over configuration. Okay. If you just do it, the standard way, you don't have to really do very much.
Sure.
So now I pretty much, I think Spring Boot is the de facto standard for any kind of Java service, server microservice development. Other than that, I dabble in JavaScript where I need to actually, I actually have the unfortunate experience of doing Java really early on. So still, what's in my head about JavaScript, and I look at the current JavaScript and it's like, I don't understand what's going on. But I'm happy that TypeScript is a thing because, I'm a static typing kind of guy.
Right.
I like static types.
Yeah.
So, Vue.js is something that I'm going to actually start to play with a lot more, probably in the next week or so on my stream.
Ooh, wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, we'll definitely talk about your Twitch stream soon. There's so much in here. I want to just dive in and pull apart and we've only got one podcast.
Never enough time.
Never enough time. Okay. So, your Java experience, is that self-taught or is that something that you actually went to, I don't know, some sort of training thing yourself and got a certificate to say that you know Java? Yeah.
So since I was learning it when they were literally writing books, it was totally self-taught. In the early days, there wasn't a lot there. And also you could, I like to think like I've learned object-oriented programming dozens of times over my career. Like each time I think I know it, and then I learn something, and I'm like, oh, I didn't know anything. Now I understand it. And then that happens repeatedly.
Sure.
And I think learning design patterns really early on, in the mid 90s, really influenced the way I think about sort of design. But in terms of learning Java, I remember one of our clients said, you have to be a certified programmer. And I'm like, all right, fine, I'll go take the test. And I took the test and I passed, but like, I didn't study for it. I'm like, there wasn't that much there. This was the JDK 1.0 or 1.1. And at that point I could, truthfully claim I pretty much know everything because in order to learn, I had to read the source code. And this was, I don't know, for those who didn't sort of grow up, in the time period I grew up, this was amazing. The fact that I could, like Visual Basic, you couldn't read any source code. You couldn't see how it worked underneath, and you couldn't figure stuff out. You had to, whatever the information they supplied, that was it. But Java not only was all of the APIs, right, the development kit, all the classes and stuff, you could read the code.
Yeah.
And that was totally new.
Yeah.
These days it's like, well, what else would it be? But those days it was like, that's totally new. And that's how I learned and learned from reading that code. What does this do? Why does this do this thing? And reading through that code was the way I learned.
Awesome. Yeah. I guess, people who are developers these days who just come into the scene, that they wouldn't have that. They wouldn't have that sort of, that background of working in this sort of closed, confined, sort of, I don't actually know what's under the hood. Imagine having a car and not being able to go under the bonnet. That's the kind of analogy, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so let's move into the world of teaching. So how did you get to the point of going, okay, I know all of this now, I'm going to teach this? What was that process like?
It was actually almost the reverse of what you just said. By teaching it, I was learning so much.
Okay.
So I remember when so to do training, you often travel because you go on site to a company to teach, to teach a bunch of folks in a room. And I remember carrying tens of pounds of books with me because I'm like, and this was the day when the Java books, the entire JDK, the documentation, you could buy as a book. even though you could like see it on your computer, you could buy it as a book. I mean, these days, like that's just crazy. But it was like these, really thick books that were really heavy, that, multiple over 1,000-page books. And so anytime, I knew enough that I could, I always like to say, it's like, as long as I'm staying half a chapter ahead of my students, I'm okay. I kind of learned that the answer, if somebody asks a question, I could say, you know what, I don't know. I'll go look it up. Either we'll try it out. It's like, I don't know what happens if you put, this class inside this other class and make it static versus non-static, whatever kind of, details. Like, let's try that out. Or I go look it up and then, talk about it the next day. And so, I learned about, the Java virtual machine and how the bytecode works and like stuff that, you probably wouldn't really look at unless you were teaching that stuff. And it was really interesting because, sort of when Java started, the surface area of it was really small. And so I could explain all those things and that would be interesting. Now there's just so much other stuff that like I don't bother teaching very much about the Java virtual machine. Although in my sort of intro classes, I still talk about it because I think it's important. It's like I'm the kind of person or the kind of teacher where I want to give you a little bit under the hood, even though you may not need it, because I think it helps build the mental models that will help you later. Sure.
I totally dig that. I totally appreciate what you just said about having to be a chapter ahead. It's like that's how I feel myself when I'm teaching. I've done some courses myself, and when a publisher comes to you and says, "Do you know X, Y, and Z?" As long as you know X and Y, you can find out what Z is.
yeah. Or even just X, and like you have an inkling of what Y is, and and Z is like, oh, I think I've heard of that. Yeah. It's that I think any good teacher has to be a good learner. I think I can't do it anyway because you have to be sort of open to that and sort of flexible enough to say, I don't know this, but I know I can figure it out. Right. So I think that's something that I've always had is like, I can always figure it out. And sometimes I will be very stubborn about, I can always figure this out. Like, I know there are times when I'm like debugging deep into some other piece of code. It's like, I got to figure this out, even though I actually don't need to know this thing because I've already solved whatever problem I was trying to solve. I want to figure out why that worked.
Right.
That can get me into trouble.
So can you talk about the actual process of teaching, and how that works?
Yeah. So there are, it's interesting because I think there's different kinds of teaching. So if it's a more formal course, where what I start with is, what do I want them to learn? That's, what in instructional design they would call learning objectives. But it's like, what do I want them to be able to do? And this will tie into TDDs, but so we can talk about that later. But it's what do I want them to do? And how do I know that they've done it? Because I want to know, if I want to teach them how to, write a test for something, the way I know they did it is I can look at their code and they can run their test and they've got it. And so what I want to do is I want to figure out like when I was building this week-long, basically spring boot camp kind of thing, where I was taking mostly new hires and new college graduates, getting them from whatever Java they learned in school all the way to writing a Spring Boot server that called out to other APIs and showed stuff, using HTML. And so what I do is I start with that end in mind, like where do I want them to get to? And then I now have a name for the technique that I use, which was figuring out, okay, what do they need to know to get to that last point? And then what do they need to go to that previous point all the way to the beginning? And I learned that that's called backwards design in instructional design. And so I use that to figure out, what do I want them to be able to build? Because for me, almost any kind of actual course that I'm teaching that's going to be hands-on, they're going to do exercises, labs. And to me, I don't like the kind of stuff they do in university in some areas, like, let's write this little thing that figures out prime numbers. Let's write this little thing that figures out this little thing. And just these disparate, separate, completely unconnected things, I don't find interesting. I find interesting, like, let's build a coffee vending machine. Where you select the type of coffee and decaf versus regular and the sizes, and then how that affects the price, and discounts, and like things that and you can take that and then break it down to then say, okay, I want to teach them inheritance. Okay, then I can use this aspect of the thing to teach them that. So for me, it's connecting the two things, but I'm always starting with like some kind of project at the end. And then figuring out how do then I tie it into concepts. And so then, like I was saying before about the bad way I used to teach Java, which is like this sort of breadth first, or no, actually maybe it's more depth first way of, here's all the types of visibility of your variables in your classes. It's like, no. We bring in those concepts as we need it, right? We need to do this. And so, we need to look at interfaces. So now we dive a little bit into that.
You're making it relatable because you're saying this is an everyday thing, like you said, a coffee machine or whatever. So they know what that is, and they know how that works. So and then because they can think of it like that, it's not just this abstract concept of this is what a function is, this is what an object is, these are what the types of the variables are, but I don't actually know how to put all this jigsaw puzzle pieces together.
Right.
You're presenting them with, this is the jigsaw puzzle picture that we're going to build. These are the pieces, and we're going to talk about each piece as we put the piece down.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you're not going to just put a bunch of random pieces around. You're going to start with the edges, and then you're going to maybe, this area is really obvious. Let me do that. And slowly you build it out and connect things together. And to me, it has to be connected. It has to be sort of this one thread that goes throughout the whole thing. Yeah. And it's, the word that comes to mind is sort of naturalistic, right? This is the way we develop software. Is like, we're writing stuff and we hit a point where it's like, we don't know how to do something. Well, what do? We go and learn it, and then we apply it. And that's the way my courses are structured and the way I teach. And so, that kind of process is, works at every level, whether it's, a 5-day class or, a 2-hour thing. But there's also things where they're not going to be doing anything hands-on. So for example, like the presentations I gave over the weekend, it's an hour. So my goal is very different there than a class. My goal is more to inform and make them aware of things, and maybe they'll retain some of it. But since they're not sort of doing anything, the learning will be very different, but it's still completely valid learning.
Yeah, definitely. Is there like, you said that you used to teach in a way that was teaching the raw fundamentals, I guess, of all of these things before teaching how to put them together. Is there anything else like that? Any other examples of where your teaching style has evolved over the years?
I definitely do a lot more asking of questions. And that's something I continue to try to get better at. It's very easy to say, here's how to do X, or here's X, here's an interface, or here's, so here's an interface. And what I want to do is that I think is not done enough is the folks in the room know stuff, and I want to get them to share it, even if it's maybe not quite right. And so I think this tendency of teachers to, and you see this a lot, like in universities is with professors, is just, you're going to listen to me talk, because I know everything. And even if they're not like thinking that, it's like, but they're still like, they're just providing lots of information, and it may be all great and all correct, but I want to get folks engaged and thinking and paying attention, because there still is a need for lecture, and I think lecture is valid. And so my goal is to use lecture, but as much as possible, get people to participate.
Yeah.
So that's definitely something I've changed just over the past few years.
Yeah.
And yeah, just learning more about how people learn and how better to teach, and trying to incorporate that research as much as possible. So, every time I teach a class, I'm like, okay, what could I do differently? Right. So this is sort of the agile retrospective kind of style of like, what could I do differently? What went well? And, I also, so sort of kind of in a lean, minimum viable product, when I first taught this one class that I was developing as a pilot, I was, talk about staying a chapter ahead. I was staying a lab ahead. So I'd be writing or modifying the next lab based on what they just did.
Okay. And
sort of on the fly. And I'm, I guess, good enough that I can do that. I would not recommend that folks do that. But I was very much on the fly, like, okay, I think we need to go in this direction. Let me create a quick lab that has them use what we just talked about, what I just explained, in a way that maybe I hadn't originally planned.
That's really, that's really interesting. It's like you become you're adapting, you're evolving as it's going along. Yeah. Awesome.
And after 8 times teaching it 10 times, now it's pretty, but even so, like I just, retaught this class for, I think it's the 15th time. And I changed something up. And the reason why is I, have been doing a lot with this hexagonal architecture. And I realized, the way I'm teaching this, I could do this so that it still abides by that, right? Because sometimes, when you're teaching, you're balancing, like, can they absorb this information versus is this good code or good architecture? Okay. And sometimes you sort of say, well, this may not be the way I would do this in a production code base, but from a learning standpoint, this is the way to do it. And that, you have to make that decision of, I'd rather them learn it and say, I wouldn't do this in the real world, but we're going to do this here because it's easier. But I saw a way where I could, put it closer together, and it's like, let me go change this lab to abide by the architecture.
Well, I guess it's a good idea to teach what bad code is. So instead of just saying this is good practice, you need to explain what that is versus what is bad practice. Yeah. Yeah.
And I focus a lot on when I'm teaching, and this is where I just didn't have the experience of developing software in Java when I first started teaching. And so this is, where some trainers get a bad name. It's like, oh, you're just a teacher. You've never actually done it. I had the advantage of, basically since 2001 through 2017, I was a software developer. I worked at eBay. I worked at, Guidewire, Google, Apple. So I'm a software developer who can teach. And so I've seen enough bad code, and I can talk about why is it bad? And the more I taught it and the more I did things, the more I realized, you learn to sort of make it more concise and make it like, here's, and now I can like distill it down to heuristics and principles. Here's this principle. Here's this rule. And if you follow these will help you, get better.
Awesome. Oh, I love hearing about the story of the evolution of trainers and programmers. I mean, you didn't mention that you worked at all those companies when we were talking about your background. That's brilliant. That's really, really good. Before we get on to the live streaming stuff, I'll ask you a question that I'll ask you in the context of Twitch in just a second, but in this case, I'll ask you it in the context of teaching. What are the biggest challenges of teaching?
I think the biggest challenge is figuring out who you're teaching, who the learner is. Okay. The biggest, and this is where sort of the difference between teaching and tutoring, I think, is important. Tutoring is one-on-one. And there you have the pleasure, the luxury of they don't know something and you can tell them. And you can set things and set examples and give them problems that are exactly at their level.
Okay.
Whereas once you have two or more people, you now have to say, well, I know not everyone's going to get this. And I know some people already know this. And so how do I sort of thread that needle of, not boring the people who know a lot and not losing the people who don't know enough? Because in any class of any size, you're going to have mixed stuff. And so I think that's my biggest challenge. And there are ways to compensate for that, like adding to the exercises, adding, optional extras.
Okay.
Like if you finish early, then you can go on to this. Whereas those who didn't, they haven't really missed anything. So I think that's really the hardest part. That's one of the hardest things. The other is, and you may know this, the curse of expertise or the curse of knowledge. Once we learn something, our brains have changed, and we've completely forgotten what it was like to not know it.
Yeah.
And so if we've forgotten what it was like to not know it, it's much, much harder to teach. And so we have to do a lot of extra work with the backwards design and figuring out, okay, I need to teach this REST template thing. Okay, that requires them to know HTTP. Okay, that requires them to know what an HTTP request looks like. Well, what's in that? Oh, they need to know headers. Well, what's in that? They need to know all that, all the way back until you're basically saying an HTTP request is sent to a socket. Well, what's a socket? What's a port? What's a domain, right? And you really have to break it down. And then you can do things like, okay, you can ask people, do you know what this is? And if they tell it to you, then okay, great. And then you keep moving on until you hit the stuff where they don't know. And then you can start explaining. But if you don't probe for that knowledge, if you don't look to see what they know, it's not nearly as much fun for them. And it's also just less efficient.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't want to be covering things that they know, because then it becomes pointless. For them to I mean, it'll refresh their memory, of course, but it's
what's interesting is where people think they know it, and that's why I ask probing questions and find out they don't have a precise definition for it. And so to me, that's really important. I'm as a teacher, very pedantic about getting terms really correct. Like if we're going to use the term mock, which is a big pet peeve of mine, we're going to talk about the 5 different types of test doubles and why mock is just one of them. And there are these other ones that you all call mocks that are not mocks, and we'll learn the names for them. Because I think it's really important, as professionals, to use a common language that actually is referring to the same thing.
I totally agree. And I'm sure that there's been many times where I've said something and it hasn't actually been the thing. Yeah.
And especially, in a professional environment, that's not as bad, but in a learning environment, being sort of lax about that, for me as a teacher, I feel like it can only lead to confusion, because they'll be thinking like, well, I heard something totally different elsewhere. And I'll tell them, you may have heard this as this thing. Like you may have, in the Java world, there's Pojos, which have 2 completely opposite meanings, which is hilarious. And I talk a little bit about the history about that and that kind of thing. And basically say, and here's how I'll use it. Or actually, I just stopped using it. And here's why I won't use it anymore, kind of thing.
Brilliant. So let's move on to the wonderful world of Twitch. When did you start teaching on Twitch?
I started late January of this year. I started my first Twitch stream.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it was that. It's so polished. I didn't realize it was that. Well,
you do 200 plus hours and it gets but if you look at the early ones, so they're all up on YouTube, at least the first 18 episodes. I'm slowly getting more and more of them up there. But I looked at some of the first ones, and one of the things that and this goes to like, what I'd recommend to newbies is do not worry about anything like the microphone or the video camera, all that kind of stuff. Just do it. Like I had my iPhone earbuds, which I realized was a horrible choice because it kept rubbing against my shirt and they'd be staticky and all sorts of but it doesn't matter. It's like, I just did it. And over time you learn and you figure out what works for you and what doesn't. But I think for me, it was a natural thing because as a trainer, and also someone who's done a lot of pair programming kind of thing. On something like Twitch, if you're just going to sit there and type and maybe make the occasional comment, that's totally fine, but that's not what I think of if you really want to be sharing and teaching in some way. You really have to externalize your thoughts. And that's something I had done really naturally because not naturally. I had to when I was teaching, when I was, live coding in front of a class. I had to say what I was doing. I'm doing this here because I need to do this thing. Or, I'm generally a quiet person and sort of an introvert. And so it takes a lot of energy from me to do that. And so when, after, like a 3 or 4 hour Twitch stream, I'm done. I'm like exhausted because I've been forcing myself throughout that whole period of saying, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I'm doing, here's why I'm doing this. Oh, I need to go figure this out. And really trying to expose my thinking, because I think that it's another form of teaching. It's not as, I think, intentional, but it's more of what we'd call modeling. Right? Sure. I'm modeling what I do as a professional. And I hadn't thought about this at the beginning, but one of the things that I hope people get from it is, I've been programming since I was 13, and I still make stupid mistakes, and I still have to search for things, and I still don't know stuff. And I hope that people who are starting out take that as, oh, okay, here's someone who's been doing it for 40 years and still has to do all these things, and that's okay.
Yeah. That's something that I struggled with right at the start when I was streaming, because I was so used to all of these polished YouTube videos and with the Pact of the Manning stuff, you couldn't put mistakes in there. It was all clean. And so I felt incredibly embarrassed right off the hop when I made a mistake, because usually my if I made a mistake and I was doing a YouTube video, which is nice and clean, I would leave a gap. I would see that in the waveform. Right. That's where I would cut. But with this, you have to go, oh yeah, there is a mistake. Plus there's more people watching than there are coding, so they can see the mistakes quicker than you can. I mean, I haven't been streaming for a long time, and I'm still, I'm very green. I'm very green, but all of these things that I didn't even think would be an issue, but yeah, they are. It's sort of like many times I've gone halfway through a stream, I'm like, this is terrible. I'm just going to come out of this stream. This is terrible, even though there's people watching, because I keep thinking it's a bad reflection upon myself, but it's not. This is actually how you code.
I still struggle with that. Like, there are going to be streams, like I had one yesterday where I think one of the hardest things, if I don't quite know what I'm doing next, and that's why I like to have a really solid project that I'm working on. And I'm sort of, I just had finished up my Twitch team shout out bot, and I'm like, okay, what do I do next? I didn't quite want to start this big new project that I'm working on. And so it was kind of like, it wasn't interesting, and I knew that, but I just pushed on through because that one of my viewers was chatting, and we were chatting about stuff, and as someone who also creates online videos and teaches, and it's like, oh, I don't know this. Oh crap, they're going to find out that I don't know this, or I just made a mistake. And that still is anxiety provoking for me. But it's taken me, hundreds of hours to sort of learn to just push through it. It's like, it's not about, Twitch is not, even though Twitch has ways of making money and so on with its subs and stuff like that, that's not why I'm doing it. And keeping that in mind, I think was very helpful for me, because, my online video courses, they're paying for it. So it needs to be good, correct, and efficient for them to learn. Twitch is just, I'm just coding and you're watching, and I'm telling you what I'm thinking. And honestly, I started out with no expectations of having any audience or any involvement from any kind of audience. I did it. You didn't ask me how I started, so I'll tell you. It's like I did it because I was struggling to do any coding on my own as an independent solo entrepreneur kind of person. I was just not getting any coding done. And so, when I'm pairing, so I have a friend who I was pairing with a lot, and it's like, we should pair more often. It's like, he's got other stuff he wants to do. And I don't know if he suggested or I mentioned it and he said, go do that. But the live coding was like, it puts me in that frame of mind of I have somebody I'm working with. And by sort of externalizing my thoughts, I found like I'm productive. I'm able to do stuff. And so even if nobody else cared, just that was a huge win for me. And all the stuff that I did was then fed back. It's sort of like it's this raw material that I'm mining that I then incorporate into my training and into my presentations. Like all the stuff that I talk about now about hexagonal architecture really came out of and was really refined by the stuff I did on the Twitch stream.
Yeah, I get that. It kind of, I like to think it humanizes programming a bit. It kind of, with the engagement with the audience and the feedback and the to and fro in real time, it kind of makes it feel like, well, it makes it feel like there's more people in the room than just yourself. And I do get what you're saying about being the solo dev, because that's essentially what I am. Yeah. and having someone watch you code can be quite scary, but it's actually quite comfortable as well at the same time, because it makes it feel like there's someone is there and they're appreciating what you're doing and you're appreciating their feedback, and it's not just you're not just coding in your bedroom on your own, right? It's you're building a community. Yeah. And so the comments that I would get from viewers and suggestions that I would get were just pure bonus. I've definitely had folks suggest things and I'm like, let's go do that. And I'll incorporate it in my code. It's like, oh, that's great. And it was really interesting that I've had a couple of times where, someone said, hey, I'm working on this thing. I could use some help. It's like, well, let's look at the code and just do it. And so I would love to do more of that. Still don't quite have the audience to get there. And, sometimes it's like this, 4 viewers and trying not to, or 2. And I don't even know if they're actually there. Right.
And so pushing through that sometimes can be hard, but, but it does pay off. And, cause that's, and since I started, unless I'm actually teaching a class where obviously I'm not going to stream, and I'm not going to stream when I get home after teaching a class because I'm already tired enough, or I'm at a conference or something, I'm doing as much streaming as I can because I know that it helps me, and it helps me do better, more focused work than anything else. Yeah.
I really dig that. I asked a question about the teaching and the challenges. I'm going to ask the same one now for Twitch. So what are the challenges for Twitch? What are the biggest challenges of doing it live?
For me, I think the hardest part is when I'm trying to do something that I'm not familiar with, and I have to go look and read at web pages. I kind of feel bad because there's I can't externalize any thoughts because I'm trying to read this documentation.
Right.
And so it is a performance, and having sort of that dead time, maybe nobody cares, but it bothers me because I feel like I should be doing something more interesting. Like it's not interesting to watch me read a web page. So that's kind of a challenge. And I go back and forth though about how much I want to fix that. because I could, before the stream, I could do a bunch of research and figure stuff out. And I sometimes do that.
Right.
But sometimes you'll get to a point where it's like, we're going to need to read something for like 5-10 minutes. We'll figure it out. So that's sort of a personal challenge. I think another thing, and I don't know if it's a challenge, but there's definitely a limit to the involvement or engagement, because all the viewers, all they can do is type letters, type words. Whereas I have full video and audio. And so it's a very unbalanced, asynchronous kind of, not asynchronous, but sort of asymmetrical kind of relationship. And so I've been trying to figure out ways I've brought on some folks to pair live. I'd love for a better way to do that. But that's something that it would be nicer, because then I feel like we could have deeper, more interesting conversations about what's going on. And then the challenge of what am I doing comes up occasionally. So like I had finished this long project that I basically the project I'd been working on since I started streaming, which was this project called Kid Money Manager. And I got to the point where, you know what, I'm done. Like it's an application, I and my family use, and it's kind of done. Maybe I'll add features. There's more work I could do on it, but I wanted to move on to something else. And I basically had a full stream on like, what am I going to do? And that was hard, because again, it was sort of me flailing about with no idea what I'm doing, and brainstorming, and but out of that came a good thing that I'm not sure if I would have come up with if I just sat there brainstorming on my own.
Right. Was that because it was an audience engaged thing? Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, I was throwing out ideas like, hey, because I want to start sort of another from scratch project. And because actually there were a couple of other projects, but I wanted another one from scratch. And, like it's like I could do a stock portfolio, like sort of going back to the stock. I was like, I could do that. And it would sort of hit all the points of like I say, basically said, what technologies do I want? It would hit all those points, but it didn't feel interesting enough. Right. And so finally I landed on a project that hit all the buttons of the technologies I wanted to cover. And this is what I tell people when they want to learn something. If you want to learn something, a language, a framework, whatever, find a project that you care about. Find something that's meaningful to you personally. And by meaningful, I mean provides some utility in your life or some benefit or fills some tiny need. I mean, this is where my project Kid Money Manager came from. I was tracking my kids' money on scraps of paper and an Excel spreadsheet. And it was like, this was really inconvenient when we're at the store and wanted to spend some money. I'd have to write down a scrap of paper and then remember to type it in the spreadsheet. Now I just send a text message to the app and it just does it. And having something that you will actually use is the best way to learn, because it goes back to sort of the way I like to teach. It's like you want to learn things as sort of this pull, right? You want to pull something out of, I need to learn how to do OAuth because I don't want to do login myself. All right, let's go learn OAuth. And I had to learn OAuth. And so that was keeping my frustration level not too high is another challenge. I got super frustrated with the OAuth stuff. It's okay to rant, but I think I was just feeling really frustrated and not happy. And I think I have to learn, like, you know what? It's okay to stop the stream and just start up later. At that point. And I actually did that. I said, you know what, this is just not working for me right now. I'm going to end the stream today and we'll pick it up tomorrow. Right.
Yeah. Some sound advice there. Some really, really sound advice. You mentioned in the challenges of live streaming that filling the air, going through the documentation and stuff. Personally, I do think that's because I think that's a good thing, because I think that's showing the audience where to look, what things to look for. It's a very different way of teaching, extremely, and it's weird because I don't think, I don't know. Personally, I don't think that Twitch has realized how much of a nugget of gold they've got here, because it's not, we're not streaming a game. It's not someone who can just play a game and you can just put it on in the background or have a little chat and have a conversation with other people in the chat. This is actually giving them some knowledge. You know, we can be affecting people's careers.
I hope so.
Which is huge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you make a good point. I mean, you know, since I know, and especially over the past couple of years, done a lot of research on, you know, how people learn and how that informs how you write good documentation. My long, you know, viewers who have been with me for a while know my little rants about when I hit some documentation, like, oh my God, this is, you know, so absolutely, like, you know, learning, like, oh, this isn't right. Let me go over here. Oh, this is weird. Let's look over here. And that process of searching and evaluating. And this is something I even try to teach in my classes, is how to evaluate where to go for information. I basically say, look, Stack Overflow should be at the bottom of your list. Stack Overflow is a last resort. You want to go to you know, sort of like I remember when, you know, I was in elementary school. It's like your primary source was not the encyclopedia. That was like, you know, that was cheating. Your primary source was whatever book or other things. Like, and Stack Overflow is like, yes, if you can't find anything anywhere else, but you have to be careful because sometimes it's a working answer, but it's not the right answer. And I differentiate between that because there's lots of ways to make stuff work that aren't kind of right.
Sure, of course.
And so I want to warn people, you know, about that. But then, you know, looking at documentation, saying, "Oh, this documentation would be so much better if so and so." And actually, recently, because it's Hacktoberfest, I actually filed a couple of PRs with one of the projects I was working with. Some on the code, but some on improving the documentation. And I think that's something that is really underappreciated. Like most of my contributions to open source projects have actually been documentation, because most people want to do the code, but I think fixing the documentation, making it easier for that next person to not have to suffer as much, I think is really valuable.
Definitely. If you've had to jump through several hoops in order to do what the documentation tells you to do, then there's obviously lots of missing documentation that needs to be added, right? Yeah. And another point I wouldn't mind adding is that it's the teaching how to debug is an art, in the sense as, you know, you don't normally get taught that in school and university. How do I debug this? When someone gives me a bug and I say, well, what does the error log say? And they say, well, where is the error log? How do I get to that error log?
Right. Well, it's interesting. So the higher level thing of debugging is troubleshooting. So to me, debugging is a part of troubleshooting, and teaching how to troubleshoot. I think you're exactly right. It's not taught. And it was really interesting because so with my Kid Money Manager app, I had, you know, was using it. I sent a text, and usually it responds within a couple of seconds, and it didn't get a response. And so I'm like, So I sent another text, and I didn't get a response. And then I got 2 responses. Okay. And I'm like, for a minute I was scared, like, oh man, did it crash? You know, did something go wrong? And it's like, that was weird. And so on my next stream, I started off with, let's go investigate what happened.
Right. Yeah.
So, you know, and I think that's really interesting because, you know, first of all, there's so many places where something could have gone wrong.
Sure.
Right. Was it the text message itself? Was it, I was using Twilio, so was it Twilio? Was it my app? I was, you know, you're always thinking like, oh, it must be my app. I did something wrong.
Right.
You know, was it Heroku where I deploy stuff onto? And going through that process of let's, you know, being scientific about it. What's our hypothesis? Well, I think it's my app because, right, of course, it's got to be my app. Well, no, it's not. Right. And then it's like, okay, what's my next hypothesis? Well, maybe Twilio. No, Twilio's fine. And I basically didn't have a solution other than it was probably Verizon, the cell phone provider. it was the one delaying stuff because everybody else was responding really quickly in less than half a second. Oh well, that happens.
Yeah.
But that process of thinking scientifically about it, and that very much relates to TDD for me, is so powerful.
Right. Yeah, I've noticed you do a lot of TDD on the streams, and I applaud you for that, because TDD is something that personally I don't think is taught enough, and it's helped me out in leaps and bounds in my career, and it's difficult to get your head around, but you do it really well. You kind of, well, you explain and then you do it, and then you explain what's happened after you've done it. And it's kind of like that sort of that process of, well, it's that backwards learning, as you mentioned. It's sort of like you explain what you're going to do, you do it, then you explain why that's worked or why that's failed, and then and it's that cycle. You demonstrate the cycle of TDD extremely well. I wish I saw. I wish I would have seen your streams when I was trying to wrap my head around the whole TDD thing.
Me too, because again, it's one of those things. Like, I thought I knew TDD, and over the past year, I've been really focused on being more kind of conscious about how I do it and thinking about how I do it, and I feel like I'm an order of magnitude better at it than I was just a year ago, because I've really and I'm better at teaching it.
Right.
And so I'm glad that you're seeing that, because I'm being much more like, because the TDD is, as mostly folks see, is like red, green refactor.
Sure.
But that's too big. Those jumps are too big. It's too high level. There's only a couple other folks who I think really dig into, well, what does red mean? What does that actually mean? What is that and so I have this it's one of the things I do on my stream, and this is the advantage of being a trainer, is I'm constantly flipping to, let me go look at this PowerPoint slide. Let me show you this PowerPoint slide where I explain this, or let me show you this diagram that I drew for a class, and we can go through that. So I sort of pull in like these, references that I have, to help explain something, and refining the TDD diagram was a breakthrough for me, and I think it's really, at least I hope it's really helped people learn the process.
Because my background of TDD is very limited. I mean, I'm still trying to learn it. I don't have a complete picture of it, but my background of it is through reading it in blogs and and not actually seeing it.
Yeah,
you have to, it's an experience. You have to experience the cycle to actually appreciate it, and you do it in a very methodical way, which is good. Before we shoot off, is there anything else that you would like to add of all the various things that we've mentioned today?
We should do another podcast about TDD.
Yeah, I think we should.
Because there's a lot of depth to TDD. One thing I'll say about that, though, is I sort of recently had, at least what to me was an epiphany about relating the way I now think about TDD and how people learn.
Right.
So with learning, it's, as a teacher, it's like, what do I want them to learn, and how will I know they learned it? And then I will give them sort of tests, in some cases actual tests, to help them learn and to probe for what they might know. I'm not going to do anything more if they already know it, versus if they don't know it, then I'll sort of do more of that. TDD is very much like that. So that the two questions I always ask with TDD is, what do I want the code to do, and how do I know it did it?
Okay.
And those two questions solve all the problems that I've seen when people are trying to start TDD. They're usually not very clear about what the code is that they want to do, or maybe they're clear, but then that second question, how do you know it did it? That's the kicker. That's the one that's like, well, I wanted to, send a text message when the balance is $50. Like, okay, how will you know? I don't know. Well, you're not gonna be able to write a test then.
Right.
You need to answer both those questions. And then you're just constantly adding more tests to flesh out what the system knows and what it doesn't know. And if you write a test and it passes, it's like, oh, maybe the system already knows how to do that, so I don't need to do anything.
Sure.
So that's sort of been relating those two things together has been really just amazing to me.
Yeah, awesome. There's a question that I ask everybody on this show, and this is if you could talk to your former self, what advice would you give? It could be more than one. It doesn't have to be technical. It could be non-technical. If you could speak to your former self, what would you say?
Trust your intuition.
Nice.
Because there were times where I couldn't explain why I thought whatever we were doing was incorrect or wrong, or there could have been a better way, or this way is better. And I'm like, well, they're the experts. I don't really know. My intuition is telling me something, but I couldn't, it's one of those where it's almost like it's some magical thing. So I didn't quite trust it. And when I didn't trust it and I basically followed other people, who were the supposed experts, it was wrong. Right. I was like, well, if I just listened to my intuition, we would have been in a different place.
Sure.
And so I've really trust it and then try to figure out, what is it telling me? How does it know this? And really kind of exploring that. And the TDD stuff is very much like that. It's like I sort of very much picked it up in a way that I was having trouble explaining. And I'm like, okay, I really need to dig into what am I thinking? What am I doing? And so the streaming has really helped with that. So yeah, going back and say, just trust your intuition. It's right. You may not know why, and you can figure it out, but trust it.
That's some solid advice. How do people get hold of you? What's all the handles?
So on all the social media stuff, I am JitterTed. So JITTER and then TED. So JitterTed on Twitter. JitterTed.live goes to my Twitch. JitterTed.tv goes to my YouTube. You can go to jitterted.com, but it'll basically redirect you. TED.dev is probably the shortest way to get to my website. And you can contact me. Probably Twitter is the best way.
Cool. I'll put all of these social links and everything in the show notes below. Do you have kind of a schedule for streaming?
Yeah, so my schedule is pretty much as long as I'm not otherwise occupied. I do Monday through Friday, Monday, Tuesday. So every day except Wednesday, I do noon to 3 o'clock my time, which is 2000 UTC. On Wednesdays, I shifted it later because of various things. But for 3 to 4 hours a day. And my schedule's up on my Twitch channel. And you can connect also on my Discord and find out details and ask questions if I'm offline or even if I'm online.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I'll go watch JitterTed. Anybody who's listening here who's doing Java, check this fella out because he knows what he's talking about. Oh, well, that was really, really good. I've learned a lot. And fascinating to hear your backstory. Thank you ever so much for coming on to the show, Ted. It was pleasure speaking to you.
My pleasure.
Awesome, and please do come on again.
Yeah, have me on again.
Lots of things that we could talk about. Yeah. Thank you very much. For those watching on the YouTubes and listening on the podcasts, happy coding, everyone. And I'll see you again soon. Cheers. Bye.
Thanks.
Before we go, I just want to say that if anybody wants to join the Discord channel, then please do so. Go to howtocodewell.net/Discord. There's channels in there for coding help. There's channels in there for coding challenges, new coders, lots of stuff for programming. There's a nice little community that's building up there. So if you've got any coding questions you want to ask, then do check out howtocodewell.net/Discord. Of course, if you want to support the channel and if you want to get early access to some of these podcasts and the tutorials that I've got on the YouTube channel, then do check out our Patreon account. That's patreon.com/howtocodewell. You'll also get access to the pro user Discord channels and the voice chat channels as well. Thanks very much. Happy coding, everyone. I'll see you again in the next one. Cheers. Bye.